Que va a impactar en los ODS la situación actual.
May I stand up?
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Let me stand up so I can see you face to face. And let me say how thrilled I am to be here together with you, Mr. President, and also the special treat to be with Enrique Iglesias. Whenever I needed wisdom, especially as a young economist that was trying to understand some part of the world, there was one person in Washington, and basically only one person in Washington that had wisdom, and that was Enrique Iglesias. He's a really great man, and it's so wonderful to see you. And when I need wisdom about Europe and the world, I always turn to President Zapatero, and so this is really a special joy. Well, we have a lot we could discuss in a very short period of time, so I will summarize everything. We're in a mess. It's a mess. And we're not effectively getting out of the mess right now. Some basic points, which I'll just put on the headlines, and then we can discuss them. First, we're at the end of the US leadership period. A lot of the uncertainties that we feel right now are because the United States does not and cannot lead. But Europe does not fill the void, and Latin America in recent years has been completely deinstitutionalized. Also, no help of the United States as usual, which can't even hold a meeting without a fight in which 8 countries end up not showing up to Los Angeles last week. So Latin America is not in an organized state of affairs. Europe is clearly not. The US has a mindset, the US government, that is, our state, has a mindset that it is still the world leader, which is rather preposterous given global realities, but it leads to tremendous mistakes. A failure of diplomacy, a failure to negotiate, a very harsh line against China, which is completely contrary to the actual needs of the planet, because we need cooperation everywhere. An us versus them mentality. So everybody is divided. Are you on our side or are you on the other side? We cannot function this way because every challenge we face is not about us versus them. COVID was not us versus them. It wasn't about vaccine nationalism. It wasn't about accusations. It was about getting a pandemic under control. I'll add one provocative statement. We could take it up later. It may shock you or not shock you, or you may say, I already know that, Professor Sachs. But I chaired a commission for The Lancet for 2 years on COVID. I'm pretty convinced it came out of US lab biotechnology, not out of nature. Just to mention, after 2 years of intensive work on this. So it's a blunder, in my view, of biotech, not an accident of a natural spillover. We don't know for sure, I should be absolutely clear. But there's enough evidence that it should be looked into, and it's not being investigated. Not in the United States, not anywhere. And I think for real reasons, that they don't want to look underneath the rug too much. Well, that got us into a tremendous mess. Now we have a war that could have been avoided. It would have been avoided if the United States had not been so insistent on pushing NATO eastward and eastward and eastward. In this discussion that we sometimes have, because we don't have much of a public debate, it is claimed that the West never promised that NATO would not go eastward, let me summarize by saying the West did promise very explicitly that NATO would not go eastward. Bill Clinton, who was not a very consequent leader for many reasons, pressure from Central European countries as well as the domestic vote, said, okay, we expand NATO eastward in the first wave. George W. Bush, who was a walking disaster from beginning to end of foreign policy, enlarged NATO 7 countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, right up to the Russian border. And then in 2008 had the great brainstorm, well, why don't we enlarge NATO all the way to Georgia? Take a look at the map. What is that about? This was supposed to be a defensive alliance against a country that no longer exists. Now it's on the other side of the Black Sea. My feeling is they were reliving the Crimean War age, that we have to bottle up Russia in the Black Sea. Well, that was Russia's attitude. I don't blame them, whether that's right or wrong. That was their attitude. We should have negotiated. Refusal, 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 refusal to negotiate. Then came 2021. Biden came into office. Putin said, we need to negotiate this. The United States said, it's off the table. We don't negotiate this issue. I know it. I mean, I know inside what happened also. But they said no negotiation on NATO at all. 3 times in 2021. In the NATO summit, which you're about to host here in Madrid, and then in 2 declarations, one with the Defense Department and one with the State Department, the United States said, not only is NATO enlargement to Ukraine already cooked in, but we are increasing the military capacity. We're sending billions of dollars of arms. Okay, you don't think that's provocative? It's provocative. So we don't discuss those things because when I say those things in the United States, A, I can't get even published in an op-ed piece, which is usually something that is not quite an issue for me, having written thousands, and because no one wants to discuss these issues. No debate. Please, next week when you host NATO here, don't just say, oh yes, United States, you're so wise. Or, oh yes, we pour more weapons into Ukraine so that more can be destroyed. Please don't do that. Because European leaders have known for 14 years how dangerous it is, but they don't say it. I'd say all the European leaders except for the UK, which knows nothing, unfortunately, because all they know is follow the US. But the rest know. This is not right. This is dangerous. We need to negotiate. We need a different approach. Russia needs to leave, but we don't need to enter afterwards. So if we actually discussed, there's an agreement to be reached. But the point, by the way, is not to push Zelensky to discuss with Putin. That's meaningless. It's the US to discuss with Putin. That's the only negotiation that counts. What can Zelensky offer? The idea that we sit back and let Zelensky negotiate is an absurdity. It's a dodge of responsibility. The one responsible is the US president. He should discuss. Also in a multilateral setting, because this really should be handled by the UN Security Council, which is not impossible. The veto issue doesn't apply here because there's no meaning to anything unless Russia also agrees. So we need an agreement where we negotiate within the UN Security Council framework. China can be a constructive part of this agreement. And that raises another issue. The United States is on a warpath with China. Why? I'll tell you why. Neurosis. Because the United States has a neurotic fear of China. And the reason is that China's a big country. And the United States is supposed to run the world. And if you're supposed to run the world in your own mind and you have this very large country, that creates a neurosis. And that's what we have. So everything is put in the worst possible terms. And everything is done in a hostile way. And how safe is it for Taiwan to have the United States every day saying, we will defend Taiwan, we will defend Taiwan? That's about the most dangerous thing you can say for Taiwan. All it does is raise the fear, raise the temperature factor. It's not calming anything. It's not defending anybody. It's just creating more anxiety. But that's the US mindset. It comes back to my first point. We're in a post-American unipolar world, if there ever was such a thing, even for a moment. But that means to take responsibility, each region. That's the key. The interesting thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they cannot be achieved country by country, anywhere. At a minimum, you need regional cooperation. Thanks God for the European Union, because that makes it possible for Europe to achieve a European Green Deal. Try that 27 times separately. Completely impossible. But as a union, it's possible. So the name of the game in this world is regional cooperation, and then the regions cooperating with each other. It's a little bit different from a country-by-country architecture. We need a strong European Union. We need a strong African Union. We need a strong Latin America. What exactly? Final point, just in opening remarks for us, is that sustainable development is not a nice thing to do. There's no alternative. There's chaos, or there's sustainable development. It's not an ideological option. We fall into not just 40-degree Celsius days in Madrid, but God knows what is going to happen as we hit tipping points on the climate, which we're going to hit year after year now. And it's much more dangerous than just the temperature going up another degree. I had the unhappy anxiety of heading a scientific institute on these issues for 15 years at Columbia. And I learned that climate scientists are the most soft-spoken, terrifying people in the world. We don't have a choice. And there's no real scientific debate. There's uncertainties, for sure. But the basics are actually quite well known. And yet, if we're going to be having war in Ukraine and refighting the Crimean War that is 170 years ago, and having our conflict with China, which goes back to the Opium Wars of 1839, and it's like America wants to relive all of the greatest dates of the British Empire. If we go through that, there is no way we're going to solve any of these problems, period. So unless we sit down, discuss, bring the scientists in, bring the engineers in, bring the public in, calm down, meet with each other, understand that we're in a common fate. Unless we do all of those things, as I said at the start, it's a mess. Thank you very much. Great. Let me start with the decarbonization. The decarbonization did not cause the rise of energy prices in the last 6 months. This is caused by not mainly the war in Ukraine, but by the sanctions that were put in response to the war. There is actually no physical shortage of oil and gas. Europe decided not to buy. That's it. Full stop. This was on some strategy that this would bring the Russian economy to its knees. I wrote repeatedly from the beginning that that was foolish. Things don't work that way. And this was not going to succeed. And it hasn't succeeded. So this is an own goal. Sorry. That's not how this is going to be ended, by Europe not buying oil and gas from Russia. Russia has alternatives. It's making a fortune at higher prices. The world is not exactly backing these sanctions. The sanctions are backed by about 15% of the world population. That is the NATO region. The rest of the world shrugs their shoulders. Don't get us involved. Thank you very much. So this is not about decarbonization. This is about a sanctions regime. I would not have followed this route. I would not have recommended that Europe put itself into a recession out of this route. I would have asked the question, is this likely to be effective? The answer is no. I would not have let the people that were so gung-ho about the war shout that down, which they did, and say, if you continue to buy, you're funding the Russian war machine and a lot of other things. Rather, I would have gone to negotiate from even before the start of the war. This is about the United States and Russia not negotiating over NATO enlargement. That's why we have the war this year. And we have the high prices because of sanctions that were put on by us that are not going to change the outcome of this war. So if we have more thought on this, we will do better. The decarbonization agenda is not a 6-month agenda. It is a 30-year agenda. It has to be pursued step by step. The most important two things are to build the zero carbon energy system. This is the core, zero carbon power, wind, solar, hydro, in Europe, some nuclear with France, and second, to build an interconnected grid. Because with an intermittent energy system, you need interconnection. And by the way, we need interconnection between the North Sea and the Black Sea. It's interesting, they are what's called a dipole of wind. So when it's windy in one place, it's still in the other. When it's still in the other place, it's windy in the first, and so on. So if you connect the North Sea and the Black Sea, you have nice, smooth wind power. So we want a grid that is interconnected and a lot of investment in zero carbon power. What does zero carbon power do? It propels our vehicles in the future. It, of course, heats and cools our buildings. It is core to electrification of a lot of current dirty industry. And it will be the basis of producing hydrogen, which will be used for ocean transport and for some other heavy industrial processes and metallurgy, especially steel making. So the roadmap technologically is known. You have great companies like Iberdrola and others that know how to do this transformation. And we need investment, not in 6 months and not blaming the war. We need investments over the next 25 or 30 years. Why isn't this happening systematically? Mainly because the fossil fuel industry has always been politically powerful for the last century. And it's been powerful, by the way, since James Watt invented the steam engine. And the hydrocarbon sector, the oil and gas sector, became the most powerful lobby in the world after Churchill decided to shift the British fleet from coal to oil. And that made that sector crucial. And so we have a political challenge. My country is a petrostate, the same way that Russia is a petrostate. The chairman of our Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, buckle your seatbelts, owns 2 coal companies. So what is his mission in life, Senator Joe Manchin? It's to stop all climate legislation in in a sting filming of a lobbyist who thought he was doing a job interview, but was actually spilling the beans about how ExxonMobil lobbies. They called Senator Joe Manchin the kingmaker of the Congress because ExxonMobil could always turn to the kingmaker. Well, this was news for about 10 seconds in America. Why? Because American politics is so corrupt. That doesn't make news. He wasn't asked to step down from the Senate committee. He wasn't asked anything about it. Because if you say there's corruption in America, they say, well, duh. You know, well, what do you think? You got a PhD to know that? So we have a political system that costs about $15 billion per election cycle right now. You think it's the poor people paying for the elections? No. So this is why we don't get consequent action. The US Senate hasn't voted one piece of climate legislation since ratifying the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. Not a single major piece of climate legislation, tiny things, but nothing significant because the system is so corrupt. And so that's the US. There's Saudi, there's Russia, there's Australia, there is all of the countries that have fossil fuels are crazy. You're just a little crazy because you just have a little bit left. And I mean, it makes it hard politically. If you have a lot, it's almost impossible to think straight. And to show how blind we are, like King Midas, like the myths, here we've discovered some hydrocarbons in the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, do we need those hydrocarbons? God, no. We have more hydrocarbons than we could ever safely burn. But look who's going crazy over this. Turkey versus Greece versus Cyprus versus Israel versus Egypt. Everybody's scrambling for this new deposit of hydrocarbons that should be left under the sea, thank you very much. There's no use for it at all. So this is our problem. We don't think straight. We don't plan properly. Our politics are corrupted. That's been an problem. And what we need is a program for the next 25 years, but we should not confuse the war and decarbonization. And we should not blame decarbonization at all for anything that's happening right now. It has nothing to do with anything that's happening right now, not at all. On the question of deglobalization, there are profoundly deep reasons for globalization. For me, the deepest reason is that I like coffee in the morning, and it does not grow in Central Park, where I live. So I want Guatemalan coffee or Indonesian coffee or Ethiopian coffee in the morning. I really want it. And I can't have it without globalization. And there are about 10 million products like that. And by the way, I like to come visit Madrid. That's globalization. And other people like to come visit as well. And I like other cultures too, because the world, maybe since the Tower of Babel, has had different cultures, different languages, different vantage points in the world. It's a beautiful part of living. I really like Chinese culture, and it goes back 3,000 years, and it's beautiful, and I want to know more about it, and I want to go visit Xi'an, and I want to go visit different places. That's globalization. And I want my students to be from these countries and go home to these countries, and I want to go give guest lectures in these countries, because that's a wonderful part of life. So what are we talking about? Now, that has all been made stronger by technology, because the technology of globalization is transport and communications. That's what connects us. So we now have the most effective transport and communications imaginable in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
And we should be globalizing every moment on Zoom and on connections. And I usually have about 10 different meetings in all different parts of the world on an average day, typical day. So even if I'm sitting in my living room, I'm globalized. And that's another wonderful thing. So I think if we measured that chart, not on physical goods and services, but on bytes or bits that are being transmitted, the globalization's off the charts. And so in this sense, we should be much more globalized and enjoying each other's company and each other's products and each other's specialization and each other's innovation. That's a goal. Now, given that globalization has been part of humanity for a long time, I'll plug my recent book called The Ages of Globalization. I argue that globalization is 70,000 years old in different waves of technology. First, it was walking and rafts, and now it is the digital age. Globalization has had setbacks. The worst setback was from 1918 to 1945. That was a disastrous period of deglobalization. So we saw what happens when nationalism comes to the forefront. You end up with economic collapse first, which was the first wave of that period, and then war, which was the second wave. We actually cannot have another world war. I don't know how, if we're going to avoid it, but we're in a different era from all of human history with the nuclear age. So we can't afford such a blunder again. So we have to think completely differently. And that makes it very hard. And when I read the stupidest thing that I've read in the last 6 months, and I've read it often, don't let Putin blackmail us with nuclear blackmail. Well, sorry, I take the risk seriously, and so should you. It's not about being blackmailed, it's about knowing that we're in a nuclear age and we should behave ourselves. Because it's a different period. And if you study the nuclear age carefully, which I've tried to do for many, many years, you know how close we've come to the brink several times. And I know about my country, we're led by a lot of stupid people very frequently. And if those stupid people had had their way 60 years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, rather than John Kennedy, who saved the world almost single-handedly against his advisors, we would have blown up the world, because every one of Kennedy's advisors in the Cuban Missile Crisis said, take out those nukes, because everything they thought they knew about them was false. All CIA intelligence, completely wrong. But Kennedy had the good sense that the world depended on him, and he said, we should be cautious, we should be diplomatic, and we should compromise. And he did. You take out your missiles, we'll take out our missiles. The big problem was that at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he insisted on keeping the trade secret. So Americans learned the lesson, we won, instead of we compromised. Had they known the truth, we might have saved ourselves a lot of grief afterwards, because we completely misread the lesson of that crisis. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was compromise. Compromise is not appeasement. Compromise is saving ourselves. And so, bottom line for me, globalization, we need it. We want it. Could it be stopped? Yes, of course it could be stopped, but it would be a disaster.
Bueno, vamos a abrir un...
I would like to ask to the professor, that it's a great pleasure to have in Spain again, Jeffrey. I would like to speak about some issue that the economists study in the last 5 centuries, that is inflation, and inflation is back. I studied with your manual in my degree, and I was professor with your manual. So usually we speak about the asset side of the economy, no? And I'm very optimistic in the asset side. The relative price is favorable for the renewables, no? The 80% of the investment, the private investment in energy in the world is in renewables. The majority of investment in mobility is sustainable, no? So there is no problem in the asset side, but I'm a little bit worried in the liability side. No? I read your fantastic book of the 1985 about the emerging crisis in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Probably the best book that I read never about the financial crisis. No? You edited the book. And imagine or suppose that after the energy crisis, we have a financial crisis. The global debt is twice than that was in the 1982. China has more debt over GDP than US. There is a bank run this week in Henan, in a province in China that has twice population than Spain. No? So how do you see the capacity to the financial markets to finance the energy and the climate transition? And if we cannot trust in animal spirits, no, how can we do? No, there is a plan B in United Nations. There is a plan B in the global governance about the financial crisis and the credit crunch. And how do you prepare for the next decade?
Should I answer?
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thanks for the nice words, and also the very good question of how we finance this transformation. There's a general point, which is that when we look at the investments that are needed for sustainable development, some are at the company or commercial level, and others are at the public level. This is a mix of public and private investment. When it comes to the public investment, this requires a fiscal framework that one has to analyze over a long period of time, because these are investments that are 10, 20, 30-year investments. And so careful fiscal management is one of the most important aspects of this transformation. As a general principle, governments need more revenue to carry out this transformation, because there need to be more public investments. So I would advocate for any government to take as hard as it is, and it's not a literal plan, but it is a planning process, to take a 30-year or 40-year perspective of the public finances, taking into account demographic change, aging populations, different expenses that will result from the care economy or the health sector, the added expenditures that will be necessary for the energy sector, and so on. Very few governments do that kind of analysis, but it's really worth doing. You have to do it alongside a public investment framework, because, as I emphasized, the energy transformation itself is not a 5-year or 10-year operation. It is basically a 30-year operation. Again, very few governments do this. It's not easy. It's also not typical. Typically, you make a 1-year budget. Some countries make a 5-year plan. Almost no countries make a 30-year framework. But actually, governments borrow 30 years, and it wouldn't hurt them to figure out what the implications are of that. The politicians don't like the story very much, because it means that public revenues are an important part of this process. The weakest part of the American political system is on the public finance. One of the reasons why America is just in a downward spiral is that Ronald Reagan came to the presidency 41 years ago and said that the key to America's success was to cut taxes. That was a political winner. It has remained a political winner for 41 years. It has been a policy disaster for 41 years. It turned the United States from a mild social democratic country to a nearly libertarian neoliberal country because we can't pay for anything. And so when you're in that spiral and you can't pay for anything, you also blame the poor because you have to blame somebody if things aren't good. So we turned into a country absolutely blaming poor people, hating poor people. This is completely dysfunctional for a society, and that's what we are in. Not to digress, the point is, if you weaken the public finances, you end up with an inability to have a decent society. The top of our rankings of SDG fulfillment are the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries reliably, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. Why? Well, one reason is they tax nearly 50% of national income. And they actually also show up, contrary to the Wall Street Journal theory of the world, they show up as the happiest countries in the world. If the Wall Street Journal were right, they would be the least happy countries in the world. They would be in a state of complete despair. If you go to Copenhagen, it doesn't look like a country in despair, by the way. It looks like a pretty happy country.
Yeah.
I once was in Stockholm and I got something in my eye and I had to step into a clinic. And of course, at the end, they did a very nice job. And I said, how do I pay? Or here's my insurance. And they looked at me like I was crazy. You don't pay, go, because it's paid. In the United States, it would have been about 8 hours of paperwork. You probably wouldn't have gotten serviced. And then it would be 18 months trying to correct the bills from the insurance company trying to charge you a co-payment of $3,400 for those 5 minutes in the clinic. So you need a public sector that is significant and large. Having said that, let me add one more different point. Developing countries are almost by definition capital scarce. That means they don't have all-weather roads, power transmission lines, power generation, safe water and sanitation for the cities, digital connectivity, even electrification, basic electrification is missing. And children are not in school, not because they don't want, but because the budget can't afford it.
Yeah.
So just a very quick example. If you're a country at $500 per capita, and there are such countries, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was a couple of weeks ago, to educate a child for a year is at least $500 per capita. So let's say it's 1 unit of GDP per person. Well, DRC has 40% of its population at school age. So to educate all the children minimally, to put them in school, would cost 40% of GDP. But the budget is 10% of GDP. Okay, so 3/4 of the kids aren't in school. What do you think the future's like for that country? What do you think the future's like for Europe as a neighbor of that country? It makes no sense. If you do the arithmetic, which is my life, you know, for a few tens of billions of dollars, you could get kids in school. That's what Europe should be doing, exactly what Violetta said. It's not even complicated. President van der Leyen should sit down with the President Macky Sall of the African Union and should say, we will accompany you so that all your children are in school. We'll help you because we need to do that, but you certainly need to do that. So we'll help you get all those kids in school. We'll also help the schools to have some electricity with solar panels on the top, some digital connectivity, so the kids also can learn something. And then you add up the bill, and believe me, it will be cheaper than what we're going to waste in Ukraine in a few weeks. And you're going to build a future, and a future for Africa. So that's really what should be done. But we don't do it right now. It's unaccountable to me why we don't do it. Because our deepest instinct should be help ensure that children have a future. There can't be anything more basic in human nature, frankly, than that. And that is systematic, and it requires a budget. And if it's an impoverished country, it requires help from a non-impoverished neighbor. So that, I think, is the basic point. I don't believe we need a debt crisis. In other words, I don't believe that it's inevitable. I believe we absolutely need to pay attention. I'm trying to help the IMF, by the way, to understand these numbers because they didn't before. And I've been working with the IMF for the last 3 years. How much does it cost to have a child in school? How much is 1 year of healthcare coverage? How much does it cost to pave a road for 1 kilometer? How much does it cost to have a gigawatt of power capacity added? They're doing a wonderful job now. Here's where they've come to. There's a big gap for poor countries of about $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion, if you're a macroeconomist, is not exactly a yawn, but it's nothing to get too unsettled about. Because $1 trillion a year is less than 1% of world output. So if you calculate that for 4 billion people, $1 trillion a year would close the financing gaps, you say, oh, this is fantastic news. This is not even hard. But then I have to get the attention, try to get the attention of a US senator or a congressman to care about this at all. None, nobody, zero. They think you're crazy. I don't even try anymore. I don't even go to Washington anymore. It's completely useless. So that's the problem.
Sí, yo solo quería. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias, presidente, por este encuentro tan interesante. Leire, Violeta y también Miguel, que está en la pantalla. And I would like to ask you, Professor, something is very important because everybody is talking about the sanctions, something that is very important to us right now in Europe. And I'm glad that you say that somehow they are not going to work. Sometimes we don't talk about this side of the story. And what about countries like Germany? So countries like Germany that depend like almost 60% of the Russian gas, how are they going to do from the next month ahead? Because if they are depending that much and they don't have enough renewable energies, how is it going to work for them? Do they have enough time? And if they not, how are they going to do that? This is something that all of us wonder, no? Okay, we can't stop importing, we can't stop buying, but how is it going to work without that gas? Thank you very much.
I don't really know the details of Russia's emergency energy planning right now, but if I were Russia, I would not stop buying oil and gas from Russia. If I were Germany, I would not stop buying oil and gas from Russia. Why do that? This isn't, we should be aiming for solutions, not for self-injury. That's all. We should be aiming for real solutions. We should be talking about NATO. We should be talking about how to get peace. We should be talking about what happened to the Minsk agreements and how we should find practical solutions. We should not be talking about punishing Putin, driving Russia to its knees. Many things that make no sense, are not going to happen, are not working, and are just doing a tremendous damage to Europe. So we should get to serious things, not these things. Of course, that's not the public mood, that's not the public statement. Until recently, the news was, well, Ukraine's winning, it's going to push Russia out of the country. This was just pure nonsense.
Not.
Why are we engaged in nonsense? This is just propaganda from the UK Foreign Office or the US. These are empty statements. We shouldn't live on empty statements. We should say, you're really going to, I mean, I said all these things inside the US government, not that they wanted to hear any of it, but they're not hard if you take a step back and you ask, is this really right? Is this really working? Is this really the right answer? The answer is no. We have no strategy right now. And you're going to host NATO in 9 days, I guess. And either it's a great cheerleading session that says everything's great, NATO's united, Sweden and Finland are joining, and we're gung-ho to send more howitzers to Ukraine. That is what to expect. And that's terrible. Or it's a serious look of real leaders, President Sanchez and Chancellor Scholz and President Macron and President Draghi and President Biden, and sit down together seriously and say, what are we doing? We're drifting, we're hurting, we're not solving the problem. Ukraine's about to become a landlocked country out of Russian occupation. What are we doing? I don't know whether they have it in them for this. I'm really mad at them for not being serious, because we're just deluged by whatever they want to say for the day. And this is far too serious for that. And there hasn't been a strategy that has made sense at all. And how did they make these predictions? How is it that today, every day, as Ukraine is getting blown to pieces, Zelensky says, we're winning, we're winning. You know they're not winning. I hope to heaven he knows they're not winning. But why are we listening to this? We should be talking seriously about what proper answers to give right now. And it's not on the battlefield where this is going to be decided, is diplomacy. And that was true from the beginning. Every time Russia takes more territory, it's a little bit harder diplomatically, but not impossible. But the United States is against diplomacy. That's a problem. But this is an alliance. It's not the US. So treat it like an alliance to discuss. If it's really an alliance, it's not the US telling everybody what to do. So this meeting should be a meeting for analysis, not for congratulations about NATO unity. This isn't about unity. This is about what we're doing and how to solve a very grave problem. It's not about rah-rah and unity and making people feel, nobody feels good. No one even believes any of this. But the point is, what is said and what is real are two completely different things right now. And you're hosting this meeting here, so there's an opportunity, seriously, to have a discussion. President Biden, you come to discuss. We warned you 14 years ago this was the wrong approach. This is not something new. We said NATO was on the wrong track. And Stoltenberg needs to do a better job. He's just a cheerleader. He's not saying anything meaningful. It makes me mad because he was a good prime minister of Norway. But as a Secretary General of NATO, all he wants to do is parrot the US line. And we need something serious, because this really is high stakes right now. And it's not about more howitzers. It's about finding a path to a negotiated peace quickly. And it's also not about Europe starving itself or thinking that it's breaking Russia. It's not breaking Russia. So the idea that you have to take the most heroic actions and economic contraction because of this is a mistake. Russian gas and oil should, and the whole sanctions idea is grossly misconceived. We also shouldn't be confiscating central bank reserves of other countries, because that's also going to be the end of our financial system. Or to me, frankly, it's a little weird. I don't have any sympathy for oligarchs in general, neither US nor Russian nor any others. But the idea, you're a friend of Putin, we take your ship, we take your apartment, we freeze your property. What is this? I never even heard of this in 67 years. And in 41 years of being an economist, I never heard the government say, you're a friend of someone we don't like, so your property is seized. That's a rule of law? That's what we're doing. I don't even get that, actually. I don't understand how it lasts for one moment, that idea. But that's really what we're doing. Somebody's apartment in I think it's Venezuelan, was seized and is being auctioned, seized by the FBI and being auctioned now because the person couldn't pay the mortgage payments because the accounts were blocked because of US sanctions. So you put on the sanctions, then you force the individual into default, then you confiscate the property, then you auction it off. This is New York City? It's like the Soviet Union. We shouldn't behave this way. So all of it is to say that we're making problems for ourselves very, very fast.
María, muchas gracias.
Gracias, presidente. Luchar contra esas desigualdades desde la Dirección General de Políticas contra la Despoblación, yo siempre mantengo que nuestra agenda es la Agenda 2030 y que la lucha contra la despoblación es la lucha contra la desigualdad. And we have the experience in the United States, and we live not so far time ago, which is the result of the perception of the citizen in the United States about the rural agenda in front of the global agenda as a 2030 agenda. And my question is, how can we improve the perception that the rural people has about this kind of agenda? How can we engage more or less with them? And I believe that the network as a SDSN or in Spain, RED, are crucial, because you are the link between the public powers, the perception of the people, and the work that you can do as a social society. So which is the way that we can afford all the actors through the 17 SDGs to improve and to learn and to expose to the rural citizen that the global agenda, the 2030 agenda, is their agenda too. Thank you very much.
One of the most impressive parts of Spain's approach to the SDGs is the innovations of new kinds of dialogue. The People's Assembly that I learned about yesterday and didn't know about, which I really like a lot. The engagement of the government with tremendous amounts of discussion, regional discussions, a commitment to addressing lagging regions or places that are especially challenged, with a lot of dialogue and participation, I think is key. Yesterday, we had a long discussion about all the different ways of engagement, and it made me reflect, sadly, about the US scene, because we don't have any of those innovations taking place. But what you point out is very much part of the US scene. The rural areas are largely Republican and Trump country. The suburban areas are the contested regions, and the urban areas are overwhelmingly the Democratic party regions. So we're really divided on the urban-rural divide. It's also in the US, it's a very big cultural divide. Division by religion, division by love of guns, division by many cultural things as well. But also, it's the rural areas suffer from absolutely the lack of public services. And when they declined over time in population, which they did, there was no compensatory or public service response. And in the US, when you lose your job, you lose your health care to an important extent. And that was also part of the decline of health in the rural areas that has been part of this. So I don't have any magic answer for this other than two basic points. One is a tremendous deliberative process, because that is the strong point of our democratic societies, and it keeps them democratic, is that kind of intensive dialogue and experimental ways like the People's Assembly. And the second is the socialization of major categories of consumption, meaning it's not even consumption, it's the wrong term, but in the accounts it's like that. Healthcare, quality education, basic infrastructure are state responsibilities. And if they are not handled by the state, then they just go into cascading decline. And that's the US scene.
Pepe, nuestro responsable del área económica.
Thank you for your intervention, Professor. During your speech, you have been talking several times about China. I've been living there for a decade. And well, after the Biden winning elections, we all thought that the situation with China, the relationship, it was going to be easier, let's say, because we were coming from a commercial trade war, but that doesn't have changed much. So the first question is, how do you see the evolution of the United States-China relation in the, let's say, next couple of years? And the second question is, well, US is bringing up, like, often the situation with Taiwan. Do you think China is going to take some actions in the near term?
Look, the US, as I said, is been on a very aggressive stance against China since about 2014. That was when the US political class decided that China was becoming dangerous to US hegemony or US primacy. And probably the single event that triggered this was the Made in China 2025 policy, which was a government policy in China that said for 10 leading industries, we intend to become world leaders in these technologies. It included semiconductors, robotics, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, new forms of aviation, precision medicine, precision agriculture. And this scared American policymakers because China was going from being a workshop for Apple phones to being an innovator of its own. And at the same time, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which was a perfectly sensible, outward-looking strategy to help develop infrastructure in China's near neighborhood and then more broadly. But suddenly this was seen also as a threat. That's something America used to do. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And so those two things triggered an American reaction. I watched it take hold in some detail. It was not any particular perfidious action by China. It was the sense that, my God, they're even larger than the United States in the IMF statistics now. So it was a fear factor. I called it a neurotic reaction. Then Trump's election in 2016, which was based on an anti-China rhetoric, alerted the Democrats too that this is good domestic politics, maybe vital domestic politics. We have to be anti-China like the Republicans. Otherwise, we'll lose the states of Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, the industrial belt where Trump won by narrow margins. So this is also a political strategy. It's not a very sophisticated strategy, but it is a political strategy. So between the deep state, which is aimed at American primacy, and not only in a metaphor, in every document, that's the American position, primacy. And again, not in an academic sense, it's in American strategic documents that we must be the dominant power in every region of the world, including Asia, plus the domestic politics led to a fulminant anti-China wave in the United States, to the point finally of starting to arrest professors that didn't properly fully declare their relations with Chinese universities and so forth. So something we're familiar with from American history in various times. Even MIT and Harvard professors being arrested, walked off campus in handcuffs. Unbelievable. And this is the mood right now. And our politicians, not very clever, not very sophisticated, not very brave, continue to play this. Our foreign policy team, very weak in my view. And so they've been not only anti-China, but deliberately rude to China in every encounter. This is quite strange because the one thing that you should learn in day one of China Diplomacy 101 is be polite. That's actually a big part of statecraft for the last 2,000 years. But in the American handbook, it is not only take substantive positions, be rude. So when you meet your Chinese counterpart, put out your hand and say, Xinjiang genocide, Taiwan and Hong Kong, how do you do? That's American diplomacy. Antagonize the other side. Then announce every day, we will defend Taiwan. Who talked about a war except the United States, saying every day, we will defend Taiwan. This is not calculated to arrive at a safe destination. I don't see anything changing right now. I don't find President Biden very supple or sophisticated. I don't find the foreign policy team up to the job. And I don't find our political class, either of the two parties, anybody saying anything contrary to the main line right now. And as elections come for November, that means nothing can change. And then after November, the next day begin the presidential elections of 2024. So that begins a new campaign, so nothing can change. So we're on some measure of dangerous path, either moderated because somebody knows to behave, or really dangerous, and also dangerous by accident because we scramble planes, they scramble planes, we don't necessarily have proper conflict avoidance modes operating at all times. Accidents could happen. We could have two fighter aircraft flying over the South China Sea hit each other. God knows some awful thing could happen. So we need prudence. That's the main word I would use, is we need prudence. But I don't know whether we have prudence. In the middle of all of this, for example, as everything's worsening, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, announces that she's flying to Taiwan. That's not prudent. That is provocative. Because we should just try to calm things down, not to stir up these crises right now. That's for Taiwan's sake first and foremost. It is for China, it's for us, it's for the world. We didn't do any favor to Ukraine cheerleading for Ukraine in 2021 rather than seriously discussing issues with Russia. And that, I fear, in Asia, we have the same approach right now, which is to stir things up rather than to be prudent.
Muy bien. Erika, la última.
A very brief question. And you already talked about the perception of the United States about China in the global south. But I would like to listen to you a little bit more about the role of China as a development agent in the global south and its engagement with sustainable development.
Yeah. China went from being a very poor country to a quite developed country in 40 years, and for 1.4 billion people. So this is the biggest single change in the world economy in a very, very long time. And it is the first time, well, Japan was the only case for a long time of an Asian country that achieved even industrialization. But this is something different. Now, East Asia is a powerhouse economically, and China is, of course, with nearly 20% of the world population, and with an economy that is, depending on measurements in purchasing power terms, bigger than the US in absolute size, and in market prices, smaller than the US, but in either event, a major economy. This is something new in the world. It's a good thing overall for the world because China went from poverty to development, and China in 2,000 years has played a major role in world civilization, and I'm glad to see China back on its feet. The reason China was so poor is part of this story. They call it the century of humiliation. China made one terrible mistake, the worst economic mistake of any country in all of world history that I know of. And that was in 1433. So 600 years ago, they stopped their naval fleet and they became an inward-looking country. And then 350 years after that, suddenly Great Britain started knocking on the door and China realized we're behind. And then in 1839, Britain launched the war for the freedom to export opium to China. Mind-boggling. So the opium wars are the opium wars for a reason, which is gangsterism, which was a large part of the British Empire. And from 1839 to 1949, it was complete disaster for China. 2 opium wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, Civil War, Japanese invasion, Civil War. So by 1949, China was completely impoverished from having been a world civilization for 2 millennia, impoverished. China then, without a long story, the first decades were complicated, but starting in 1978, probably the greatest economic reform in history of scale took hold under Deng Xiaoping with the opening of China. And in 4 decades, China went from impoverishment to a highly innovative, dynamic economy. The big problem, in quotation marks, from the US point of view, is they became powerful, but not under our supervision. The Americans have the audacity to say, we believed that they would become a liberal democracy like us if they developed, but that failed, so now we have to confront them. That's the American mindset. It's a little ignorant because China's statecraft, centralized state, is not about the People's Republic of China or the Communist Party of China. It started in 221 BC. Centralized state. It started with the Han Empire. So this is a long story. Americans don't care, don't understand it. Now, your question is, what does it mean for China and the world? If we have peace, which I'm counting on because I can't imagine the alternative, I hope and look forward to China being a highly prosperous, dynamic, outward-looking country that is a pillar of the international system. I would like Europe and China to have good relations and to deal with each other. China will not be a democracy in the form of European parliamentary democracy. It will have its own statecraft. There will be imperfections like there are anywhere. It's not our business other than to have good discussion about different options and so forth, but we should have good relations with China. We should work together. We should analyze common problems. We should say, you have wisdom of 2,000 years. What would Confucius say about this? What would deep Chinese values say about this? It sounds silly, but I think it's a very serious point. I'm hosting a meeting in Athens of Confucian and Aristotelian scholars because I want to know what both those philosophers, what their philosophies can add to our modern problem solving. I actually believe a lot because they teach us about order, virtue, basic human nature questions. So my view is engage with this remarkable civilization, be thankful that it has escaped from poverty, that it is innovating. I'm grateful, for example, that Chinese scientists developed the most effective treatment for malaria that we have, from an ancient Chinese herbal treatment from Qinghua So, which we use the extract artemisinin, which is saving millions of lives every year in Africa and Southeast Asia because of what a Nobel laureate Chinese scientist developed of an ancient practice. Well, there's a lot of that can come. I was delighted, I mentioned yesterday that downstairs nearby on Gran Via, there's the Huawei building. Okay, I went to Huawei, my wife and I visited Huawei a couple of times. We went in 2019, incredibly impressive. So impressive that the United States insisted on shutting them down. Why? Because they got better at 5G than any US company, that's why. And then the US said, well, they can spy on us. That's not the real answer. The real answer is if it's an American equipment, then the US can spy on me. If it's Huawei equipment, it's a lot harder for the US to spy on me. So the fact of the matter is the US just tried to shut down Huawei because they made beautiful, low-cost 5G systems for developing countries that were going to sweep the world. And so the US had to go threaten everybody. Don't do business with them. So this is the first Huawei store that I've seen in a long time. You wouldn't find anyone in the United States. But the point I'm making is let us engage constructively. And China has a huge amount to offer for the world. And if we engage, it's not going to take over the world. And by the way, aside from many other reasons why China's not going to take over the world, China's population is going to fall by about 400 million people in the next 80 years. China's going to become old. I kind of appreciate that these days more than I would have before. But I also really feel old people don't want to take over the world. They just want quiet, you know? We want peace. We want nice. And that, I think, is what China will want as well. Thanks.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias por su participación. Debo decir que escuché. Thank you.